When we picture ancient Rome, we think of power, triumph, and unstoppable military glory. Marble temples rise in our imagination, along with golden statues and victorious emperors wearing their crowns of laurel. Rome looks like a monument of strength carved into history, a place where civilization reached its highest form. But this empire is not what it seems, because its real strength did not come from marble or armies. It came from the minds it conquered. Rome did not only chain bodies, it learned how to break people without leaving a single scar. The secret to Roman power was not the sword, but the slow destruction of a human spirit until obedience felt natural and resistance felt impossible. This hidden method of control is what allowed Rome to survive for centuries. If Rome had relied only on violence, the system would have collapsed under the weight of rebellion. The scars would have led to revolt, the fear would have fueled anger, and the chains would have snapped under desperation. But Rome understood a darker truth. A body can be forced, but a broken mind will force itself. So instead of fighting slaves every day, Rome taught them to fight themselves. If Rome did not learn to break slaves from the inside, the empire would have been destroyed from within. The greatest weapon of Rome was not brutality, but conditioning. A slave who forgets they are human never dreams of freedom, and an empire built on silence never hears the sound of revolt until it is far too late. The first way Rome defeated a slave was not through pain, but through removal of identity. The moment a person became a slave, their past was erased. Their family name disappeared. Their homeland no longer mattered, and their personal history was treated as if it had never existed. A human being became a replaceable object. Rome understood that as long as a slave still remembered who they once were, some piece of them would still resist. So the empire broke that memory. A slave could not keep their old name, their old customs, or the language of their childhood. Their new existence began with silence. Rome did not need to cut the body when it could cut the roots of the soul. A person without identity becomes easier to command because they no longer stand on anything strong enough to fight from. Their worth was redefined by ownership, not by birth. In Roman law, a slave was not a who but a what. They were listed the same way livestock or furniture would be listed. The world no longer saw them as people, and slowly they stopped seeing themselves that way too. This was the first and deepest wound, the invisible one that never healed. Once identity was destroyed, obedience was no longer forced. It began to feel like the natural order of things. A person who forgets that they once had freedom becomes someone who cannot imagine it anymore. And that is exactly what Rome wanted. Not a slave in chains, but a slave who forgot they were ever meant to stand upright at all. After erasing identity, Rome's next step was to make the slave dependent for everything: food, safety, clothing, permission to speak, permission to rest, even permission to hope. A slave could not survive without the master, so the master slowly became the center of their world. This was not mercy, it was design. When every basic human need is controlled by another person, resistance feels dangerous and obedience feels like survival. Rome perfected a system where slaves did not just obey orders. They began to fear independence. When someone learns that every comfort is a reward, and every small mistake can take that reward away, they become trapped in quiet self-discipline. They punish themselves before anyone else has to. The empire no longer needed chains on every wrist, because the mind became the shackle. This is how helplessness is manufactured, not in a single moment, but slowly, until the person forgets they once lived without permission. The strongest cage is not iron. It is the belief that escape is impossible. Rome understood this early. A slave who depends on his master to live will guard his own prison and call it protection. And once that belief settles inside the mind, rebellion dies long before it ever reaches the hand. Once Rome had erased identity and created dependence, the next tool was controlled privilege. Small bits of kindness used not to heal, but to tame. A slave who believes punishment is the only reality will eventually collapse, but a slave who is given tiny rewards learns to chase approval instead of freedom. This was not mercy, it was psychological bait. Rome discovered that hope is stronger than fear when it is rationed like water in a desert. A slave might be allowed a better sleeping space, lighter work, or a rare moment of praise. But these gifts were never secure. They could be taken away at any time. That uncertainty kept the mind obedient far more effectively than the whip. Rome taught slaves to link identity to obedience. If I am good, I am treated better. If I displease, I disappear. So the slave begins to police their tone, their posture, even their private thoughts. They do not rebel because they fear losing the crumbs they have been given. The illusion of upward mobility was Rome's most silent weapon. Some slaves were told they might earn freedom, but only through perfect obedience. This created competition among slaves themselves, turning them against one another before they could ever unite. A person who hopes for manumission will not risk punishment, and a person chasing favor becomes their own jailer. In this way, Rome did not just enslave bodies, it enslaved ambition. After Rome conditioned the mind with dependence and controlled reward, it sealed the transformation through public humiliation. This was the moment a slave was not only broken privately, but erased socially. Rome made sure everyone could see who was human and who was not. A slave could not wear the clothing of a free citizen, could not walk with dignity, could not defend their honor, and could not even testify legally as a full person. The system did not just control the slave. It taught society to see that slave as less than human. This is called social death, being alive, but officially treated as if your humanity had already been buried. Public identity became a cage stronger than chains. Even the most skilled or educated slaves, like teachers or doctors, could never cross the invisible line that separated person from property. Rome stripped dignity by law, not just by attitude. A slave's humiliation was not an accident of cruelty. It was a legal requirement. The empire wanted the world to watch and remember their place. When every eye sees you as inferior, you begin to see yourself the same way. And once humiliation becomes normal, resistance begins to feel foolish, even dangerous. This is how Rome maintained silence without needing constant violence. The greatest punishment was not pain, it was invisibility. The slave did not just lose freedom of movement, they lost the right to be someone. And when a person is denied identity long enough, they begin to forget they were ever meant to have one. Once Rome had erased identity, created dependency, and enforced humiliation. It maintained control through something even more powerful than punishment, fear of what would happen if the system was challenged. Rome never forgot the Spartacus revolt, and it never wanted to feel that terror again. From that moment forward, the empire learned to fight rebellion before it ever began, not with open force, but with constant psychological pressure. Slaves lived knowing that even the whisper of disobedience could bring death, not just for them, but for everyone around them. Suspicion alone was enough to justify execution. Rome used this fear like a shadow over their minds. The slave did not wait to be punished. They feared they might already be watched. Freedom was not fought for, because Rome made sure the idea of resistance felt hopeless long before it reached the surface. Even when a slave earned manumission, the fear did not end. A freed slave was still a marked person, forever separated from true Roman citizenship. They could walk the streets, but not belong to them. They could breathe the air, but never rise above their past. Their chains were removed from the wrists, but never from their reputation. Rome had engineered a system where no one truly escaped, only changed categories of control. So in the end, the strongest prison was not stone walls or iron shackles. It was a mind trained to obey, a spirit taught to fear its own courage, and a world built to remind them they would never be equal. Rome had perfected the invisible cage, a system where revolt no longer needed to be crushed. Because it was never born, Rome is remembered for its legions, its marble roads, its grand arenas, and its towering monuments. But the true foundation of Roman power was not stone or steel. It was psychological control. The empire did not survive by chaining hands. It survived by chaining belief. A broken mind does not dream of escape, and a silenced identity does not remember that it was ever meant to stand tall. Rome mastered the art of conquering without visible wounds, turning human beings into shadows of themselves long before a whip or sword was ever raised. This is why the Roman system lasted so long. The empire did not wait for rebellion to rise. It smothered rebellion inside the human spirit. The most terrifying cruelty was not what Rome did to the body, but what it did to the soul. And as we look back today, we must ask a difficult question. How many systems in history kept power not through violence, but through quiet obedience, humiliation, and the rewriting of identity? Rome may have fallen, but the method it perfected never truly disappeared.